why don't we, if you don't mind just pulling the door in just slightly so that we don't have much noise coming in. My name is Osei Aline, Ph.D. recent Ph.D. in Africana and Anthropology, and currently a postdoc in EE at Penn, known as Experimental Ethnography at Penn, with deepest gratitude. With deepest gratitude. The Scholar for a Day event has had a long history at the University of Pennsylvania. For almost 2 decades, the Africa Center brought notable scholars of the African continent to commune for a day with graduate students, the purpose of which has been not only to enrich the theoretical skills of young Africanists of one field or another, but by exposing students in an intimate way to established and influential scholars, professionalize budding minds in the field. Among the most notable invitees in the past years have been African anthropologists such as the Kamaroffs, Peter Geshier, James Ferguson, as well as notable African philosophers like Achille Mbembe, V.Y. Mudimbe, and Kwame Anthony Appiah, no less. When in 2015 the growing Africana Studies Department took on the activities of the Africa Center, the Scholar for a Day tradition took a hiatus in order to regroup and reinvent itself. Today, February 9th, 2018, we now take the opportunity to celebrate the return of the tradition, that is, with our very special guest, Africanist, anthropologist, and African American Studies scholar, Dr. Jemima Pierre of UCLA, as well as our featured filmmaker and scholar, Dr. Mamfatou Niang of Carnegie Mellon University. The event, however, could not have been revived without the express support of a number of different groups and individuals who worked tirelessly to make this event happen. And I want to single out here Professor Ali Dinar, who I convened with many times in order to understand what it is we were doing, me not having the opportunity to have been a part of it in the past. Professor Heather Williams, very much an advisor of mine in many ways. I see my own advisor here in the audience as well, Dr. Deborah Thomas, who I'm ever grateful to. Departmental executives, Ms. Gail Garrison, Ms. Carol Davis, keep the wheels turning. The design and technical support of Sean P. Fields, whose graphic design definitely was inspiring and very cool, gave us the varnish that we needed to have this look the way we wanted it to. And also program support from Shantala Thompson. I want to take a moment to thank our conveners, Grace Saunders Johnson, an assistant professor here in Africana Studies, Crystal Strong, who I'll give the floor to in a moment. I can't forget, of course, my comrades in arms, my cohort members, my anthropology folks, Michelle Muniqua in Anthropology and Medicine, Sarah Rendo and Amber Henry of the first panel this morning. Thank you so much. I knew I could count on you guys. Thank you so much. The millions of text messages and, did you read anything yet? Of course, Selena Desai, my own cohort twin. Where is she? Somewhere in here, right in front of me. Spending very soon. Jasmine Blanks Jones, my current co-conspirator in drumming up things all over the campus right about now. And of course, Astrid Charles, who just put on an excellent event last night as well. I heard it was well attended, as well as a moment ago, having that meeting and discussion with Dr. Mamfatou Niang. Of course, I have to again thank our scholars from traveling in from the various distances. Dr. Mamfatou Niang, Assistant Professor of Modern Languages at Carnegie Mellon, and also, of course, Dr. Jemima Pierre, Associate Professor, Anthropology and Africana Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, scholars all, without any further ado, I give the floor to Crystal Strong.
Good afternoon. Thank you for responding. How's everyone doing? People don't always respond. Do it again. I should do it again? Okay. Yeah. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm sorry. I'm just messing things up. How do I fix this? Sorry about that. As Osei mentioned, my name is Crystal Strong. I'm an assistant professor in the Graduate School of Education, also an affiliated faculty with Africana Studies and a part of the Anthropology graduate group. I'm going to try to keep my comments brief because I know I'm the only thing standing in between you and our scholar for the day. So, if you are just joining us for the keynote address, you have really missed an incredibly enriching and intellectually generative set of conversations around the work of our scholar for the day, Dr. Jemima Pierre. This morning, doctoral students situated in Africana studies, anthropology, education, medicine, they all shared works in progress, engaged directly with Dr. Pierre's work, and had the opportunity to ask questions around points of intersection around their research areas. Our students' work is truly impressive, nuanced, theoretically textured, and I must say that it was a real treat to witness this kind of engagement, particularly because this kind of engagement is not typically afforded within the conference format. So thank you to the organizer of today's proceedings, Dr. Osea Lane, and also everyone who was mentioned, who brought this event to light, or brought this event back after a hiatus of some years, as was mentioned. So for those of you like myself who are relatively new to the Penn community, learning that the Scholar for a Day event has such a long history within this department was a real revelation for me. Now, in just a moment, I'm going to get to introducing our keynote speaker, but I felt that I couldn't let this moment go without pointing out a few reasons why I think 2018 is an especially auspicious time to be interrogating the space cultivated for the study of Africa here at Penn, and more broadly in the field of Africana studies, which in the predicament of Blackness, Dr. Pierre refers to this as the question of the status of Africa in African diaspora studies. So in 2018, we're celebrating 2 anniversaries that I think are incredibly important to note for us, particularly given the kind of intellectual and political projects underpinning Dr. Pierre's work. So the first is the 150th anniversary, the 150th birthday celebration of W.E.B. Du Bois, who we all know his path-breaking scholarship of the Philadelphia Negro ties him to Penn specifically. If you are not aware and you are local, Philadelphia is celebrating the year of Du Bois in 2018. So starting at the end of this month, around the city, there will be various symposia, there will be reading circles around Du Bois's major scholarly works, including the Philadelphia Negro and the World in Africa. This is a sort of community-centered practice that was a partnership with Dr. Anthony Montero at Temple University, as well as a number of scholars and activists throughout the city of Philadelphia. If you're around, I encourage you to put yourself in those spaces. In addition to that, 2018 marks 75 years since Kwame Nkrumah received his master's degree on this campus at Penn GSC. To my knowledge, there is no comparable celebration or memorialization of Nkrumah's time on this campus and in this city, which I'm sure we all know also involved his time at Lincoln University, the historically Black college. But the year is still young, right? It's February. It's not too late for us to pull ourselves together and give Nkrumah's legacy on this campus the kind of memorialization that it deserves. So we know that both Du Bois and Nkrumah's paths converged around Pan-Africanism, questions related to Africa's independence, as well as in Nkrumah's native Ghana, also the site of Dr. Pierre's work, where we know Du Bois died working on the Encyclopedia Africa project. I think their paths bring to fore both the intellectual as well as the political stakes of the kind of work that Dr. Pierre is doing. So I will talk a little bit now about who Dr. Pierre is and cede the floor so that you can share what you have to share with us today about Africa and the Black Studies Project. So Dr. Jemima Pierre is an associate professor jointly appointed in the Departments of African American Studies and Anthropology at UCLA, where she also serves as the associate director of the James Coleman African Studies Center and as chair of the Masters in African Studies program. Her research and teaching interests are located in the overlaps between African studies and African diaspora studies, and engage the following areas: race and political economy, transnationalism and diaspora, and the politics of knowledge production. I was very excited to learn about a couple of forthcoming projects that Dr. Pierre is working on. You all are probably very familiar now with The Predicament of Blackness, Post-Colonial Ghana and the Politics of Race, which was either awarded or nominated for several prizes, including the 2014 Elliott Skinner Book Award in Africanist Anthropology. She's also working on a few manuscripts related to race in Africa, and also a more longitudinal project that focuses on resource extraction in West Africa through the framework of racial capitalism. All very exciting works. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Pierre, and I hope you will join me in welcoming her to the podium. Thank you.
I'm going to sit if it's okay.
Or
okay.
sitting at the
Thank you. What an honor it is to be Scholar for a Day. I'm shocked that I'm humbled by the experience, and it's really, truly, as a scholar, you don't get the chance to sit and have people like deeply engage with your work and read back your words to you. And so and I'm really grateful because there's such a great the grad students here are doing amazing work, and it's incredible, and I'm so grateful to be part of that conversation. I'd like to first thank Osei for convincing me to do Scholar for a Day and dealing with my lack of response to emails, and thank you for that. Thank you for coming on a Friday afternoon to the audience. Thanks to Carol Davis for making this possible, doing all the background work, and then the faculty and staff of Africana Studies for hosting me. So I'm just going to go right into my talk. I'm going to begin with two historical vignettes. Some of you might be familiar with one of them at least. Okay. So during the first 10 years of Ghana's independence, the U.S. government intervened culturally and politically to influence the terms of interaction among Black Americans and continental Africans. Ghana was the Cold War battleground in Africa as the U.S. sparred with the Soviet Union and China for political influence in the new Africa. So this seems like history is repeating itself. And race relations was the site of this sparring. Combined Soviet and Chinese propaganda and the Nkrumah government's increasingly relentless attacks on the treatment and status of Black Americans caused consternation and concern among U.S. government operatives. Negative foreign perception of U.S. race relations, policy advisors feared, would become a major diplomatic problem, adversely affecting U.S. relations with new nations in Africa. Attacks on U.S. racism from communist and Ghanaian state presses were so sharp and pronounced that they often drove U.S. diplomats in Ghana to lodge formal protests with the Ghanaian government. More importantly, however, they forced U.S. government agencies to take swift actions to combat such negative views, both to ensure that the condition of African Americans did not become an impediment to diplomacy and to soften the impact of communist propaganda in Africa. The United States Information Agency, USIA, and these days it's USAID, by the way, in Ghana, with the support of the State Department's Board of Cultural Affairs and Psychological Propaganda, which is a real name, embarked on a major cultural offensive that sought not so much to deny U.S. anti-Black racism as to articulate a strong narrative of African American racial progress. U.S. foreign policy officials felt that a focus on the achievements of African Americans in the areas of education, politics, and economics would demonstrate to continental Africans that things had been improving and would continue to improve over time. They decided on a visual campaign that would have broad reach and especially influence Ghanaian students, teachers, and civil servants. This campaign included numerous exhibits and conferences, distribution of pamphlets on African Americans, and prominent sponsorship of major cultural and educational events in Ghana featuring African Americans. The exhibits were wildly popular with young Ghanaians. The USIA library staff in Ghana reported increased membership with special interest in the works of African American authors. More importantly, the Ghana African American campaign was so successful that it became the model for U.S. cultural propaganda in other African nations throughout the 1960s. Right. So this is the second vignette. The Ghana Concert Party Theater is a set of stage vernacular shows that combine slapstick musical comedies, folk stories, acrobatics, moral sermons, magical displays, and dance music sessions. They are wildly popular throughout the country, are recognized as a national cultural production, and have served as a cultural vortex in Ghana, impacting everything from music to dance. Significantly and ironically, the concert party theater is infused with key acts that depend on blackface minstrelsy. Catherine Cole traces the use of minstrel images in Ghana to theatrical conventions in colonial Africa. These conventions were transported from the U.S., which by the 1900s had a long tradition of minstrel performances. By the late 1920s, minstrel performances had moved from New York vaudeville houses to Hollywood through such films as Al Jolson's Mammy, which recreated in film the classic 19th century minstrel show. These films were distributed throughout the world, and particularly in remote colonial outposts. Such minstrel films were primarily for the white colonial class, but Africans would later see them. Ironically, however, Jolson's movies attracted Africans who often copied the fashions and dance steps believed to be authentically Black American. In this, and in the future development of the Ghanaian concert party, we see the ways that the ideologies of race and blackness, in the figure of the blackface minstrel, traveled. As Cole tells us, these travels, similar to raw materials, commodities, and Africans, linked nations, colonies, and empires. Indeed, the concert party found fertile soil in the ideology of white supremacy that shaped relations between white and non-white populations. I would also add that such representations shaped the perceptions and relations of African Black and diasporic Black populations, along with the British colonial policy of allowing racial affiliation that was no threat to empire, while actively curtailing such affiliations when it stood against colonial rule. It enabled the dissemination of particular images of blackness and notions of racial consciousness. In this way, it becomes clear that Ghanaian racialized consciousness is neither a presentist projection nor an imposition of a Black nationalist or Pan-Africanist desire. It is a historical fact of Ghana's past. And this is a quote by Kweku Koreng, I think somebody mentioned earlier. These little known histories of U.S. cultural propaganda and of the transnational impact of U.S. Black minstrelsy in Ghana and Africa more broadly may not be surprising, but I deploy them here to make the case that such cultural projects reflect a long trajectory of cross-Atlantic interactions in which the legacies of slavery and colonialism and the racial constructions of European empire making rendered analogous the experiences and identities of Black peoples in Africa and throughout the diaspora. They also reveal how the mutual constitution of local agency and global racial processes work to mediate underground relationships between diaspora Blacks and continental Africans. In my work, my concern has been to provoke a rethinking of the contours of Black identity formation by calling attention to the ongoing mutual constitution of the experiences of continental African and diaspora communities. These experiences are historically significant as they have been shaped through specific rise of U.S. and European and U.S. empires. But to acknowledge the mutual constitution of continental and diasporic experience is to first recognize there is a clear divide between the studies that deal with Africa, still, on the one hand, and those that trace race and transnational Blackness on the other. In other words, there's African studies, and then there's Black studies. I contend that this divide results from an epistemological and political trend that has facilitated the construction of rigid ideological and conceptual boundaries that do not adequately reflect the complex realities of the communities on either side of the Atlantic. Confronting and understanding this divide remains a key objective in my research agenda and will frame the rest of my discussion today. I'm arguing that the general epistemological and conceptual bifurcation of African studies and Black studies is not accidental, and it is relatively recent. Indeed, the recognition that common historical displacement and attendant racial distinctions are constitutive of the modern Black experience on both sides of the Atlantic is actually not novel. It was a conceptual, theoretical, and empirical and political imperative for early scholars of the global Black experience. The critical and political tradition established as given the significance of the overarching colonial order that structured the modern world. In the late 1970s, the anthropologist St. Clair Drake saw African diaspora studies as an intellectual byproduct of the ideological and political split between what he deemed continental and traditional visions of Pan-Africanism. Diaspora studies was still an important aspect of traditional Pan-African activity, he said, but it was a particularly New World response to the emerging independent continental African politics. For Drake, independence from colonialism shifted the priorities of Africans from transcontinental collaboration against racism and imperialism to nation building and continental cooperation. Consequently, the struggle against racial oppression was understood by Drake and others to be primarily an issue for diaspora blacks. It is significant that Drake attributes this continental diasporic divide partly to a shift in race thinking, placing African nationalist sentiment in contradistinction to black diaspora racial cooperation and political organization. The assumption, of course, is that independence and political sovereignty ushered in an era for continental Africans where issues of race and its connections with imperialism were no longer primary concerns. I suggest, however, that Drake's marking of this shift is important for broader and more substantial reasons. Taking the year 1945 as a point of departure, we can see how African and diaspora international cooperation, as well as scholarship, were transformed through drastic changes in global politics. These changes brought about not only the realignment of relationships among nations and the restructuring of the global political economy, but they also helped determine the terms of intellectual engagement for Black studies. And key to the shaping of Black studies were new liberal definitions of race and the popular adoption of the apolitical framing of the continental of Africa. To understand how this came to be, we have to extend our historical lens while bringing together discussions of methodology and epistemology with the relationships of worldwide political imperatives, academic and disciplinary exigencies, and the dynamics of racialized knowledge production. Here, origin stories are instructive. In the introduction of their 1999 edited volume, Out of One, Many Africas, editor William G. Martin and Michael O. West framed the history of the global study of Black populations within three intellectual traditions: Africanist, continental, and transcontinental. The Africanist tradition brings together the European and North American studies of Africa that begins with empire, with European colonial rule of the continent, and expands in the post-World War II period with the elevation of North American Africanists. The Africanist tradition emerged in the context of U.S. ascendancy as a global superpower and was part of the dramatic development of area studies in universities powered by Cold War politics and generously funded by major foundations. With the backing of the U.S. government, the Africanist presence in the academy from the outset demanded a strong policy orientation befitting its close association with the extension of U.S. power across the world. More importantly, the Africanist tradition, its established paradigms, programs, and international networks, was built upon intellectual, material, and racial pillars of U.S. national politics. This meant, in particular, the purposeful displacement of a competing and older tradition of Black scholarship, and along with that, the conceptual division of the study of Africa and the diaspora. Anthropologist Elliot Skinner, for example, discusses how Black scholars of Africa in historically Black colleges and universities were ignored by the newly minted white Africanist establishment and were often denied foundation funding. In fact, while the majority of Africanist scholars in pre-war years were from the Black diaspora, especially the U.S. and the Caribbean, few could find research funds for research in Africa, and few published. HBCUs were also excluded as foundations searched for potential sites to house African Studies centers. So if you look around, the 9 African Studies centers were all established in predominantly white institutions in the 60s. The continental and transcontinental traditions, however, are clear examples of these, the continental and transcontinental traditions are clear examples of these differences, as West and Martin contend. The study of Africa by scholars based on the African continent, that's the continental tradition, is the most recent of the 3 traditions, and is considered largely a reaction to the intellectual hegemony of the Africanist enterprise and the hubris, this is a quote, and the hubris and racial arrogance of Africanist scholars, end quote. Unlike those within the Africanist tradition, the generation of post-colonial African scholars often works without the benefit of state or foundational support. Some such scholars are affiliated with a series of regional research institutions outside of their universities, while others are dependent on intermittent and short-term academic positions in Western nations. The regional research institutions, such as Cadastra, for example, moreover, are usually funded by Western donor organizations, a fact that often shapes scholarly output and generally limits its capacity for broad impact. The continental tradition, therefore, does not have the power or global authority of its Africanist counterpart. Its research agenda is usually focused on establishing or promoting indigenous paradigms and intellectual frameworks with specific reference to what are seen as the concrete problems and conditions on the continent. While clearly an important endeavor in self-representation, especially as a response to Western Africanist traditions and continued pathological representations of Africans, continental scholars, with exceptions, nevertheless followed a number of conceptual and epistemological paradigms similar to those followed by their Africanist counterparts. These included the treatment of the continent or some of its regions as isolates, and crucially the maintenance of the Africa-diaspora conceptual divide, as well as, some would say, the North Sub-Saharan Africa divide, which itself is a racialized and geographical treatment of the continent. In this way, in the type of isolated continental focus and research subject matter, it is in this way that the continental tradition is both similar to the Africanist one and different from the transcontinental one. Unlike the Africanist tradition, the transcontinental tradition did not develop within the context of specific nation-state geopolitics and did not achieve the high status and official sanction and sponsorship necessary for institutionalization. This tradition depended on a loose collection of mostly black scholars and activists based in North America, the Caribbean, Europe, and Africa, whose work to dismantle the global structures of Western empire, the global power structures of Western empire. Although scholarship in this tradition is usually considered vindicationist, and an appropriate label given the historical and ongoing need to challenge the Eurocentric dehumanization of black peoples, this designation often obscures its other important epistemological claims about the role of scientific research in the pursuit of social justice and in challenging ideas about structural and institutional power. In this framing, the transcontinental tradition differed considerably from the Africanist and to a lesser extent continental one, both in purpose and content. On the one hand, the transcontinentalist concern with the effects of global structures on racialized, non-white communities resulted in scholarly output that was inherently transnational and that methodologically relied on the examination of broad cultural and political processes informing transatlantic connections among black communities. On the other hand, the Africanist traditions presume concern with scientific objectivity in the post-1950s study of Africa was area and region specific and encouraged intense and focused specializations on tribes or ethnics within the continent, often at the expense of structural analysis linking the continent to the rest of the world and to global history. Yet, to better understand these differences on the continent theory of black studies, we should go back further in history. The post-World War II period becomes especially significant here because it signals a watershed moment in global politics and in knowledge production. As we have seen, the powerful position of the U.S. at this moment enabled the development of area studies that shifted the orientation of African studies, establishing paradigms that worked in the logic of empire, to contain or direct anti-colonial movements, and later to influence independent African states. This strategy followed the British School of African Studies that developed alongside the empire's colonial ventures. The primary concern of that school was to acquire knowledge about ethnicity or tribal or ethnic groups in the service of, quote, pacification and creating divisions, end quote. This is Horace Campbell's description. However, the success of this new model of U.S.-based African studies in the post-World War II era also depended on the opening provided by social-political events in the country, in the U.S., that included, among other things, the fragmentation of the black radical left, the emergence of McCarthyism, and the rise of Cold War liberalism. The fragmentation of the black radical left in the post-war period reflects ongoing generational shifts in the political orientation of U.S. black political leadership. As Penny Von Eschen aptly demonstrates in her study, Race Against Empire, U.S. black scholars and activists in the pre-war era sought to create a global movement for black emancipation by explicitly and continuously linking Jim Crow racism with imperialism. Discussions about U.S. racism occurred alongside those about colonialism and were set within a broader understanding of the global system of empire and racial capitalism that exploited and appropriated the land, labor, and bodies of black people scattered all over the world. Although it was a movement spearheaded by a small and outnumbered group of black scholar activists, it nevertheless attained wide popularity among black populations in the U.S. and internationally immediately after the war. This powerful moment in black radicalism did not survive the Cold War period, however. In what Vignettes describes as an abrupt fragmentation in opinion among U.S. black scholars and activists, the broad support for radical international politics and organizing would quickly fade with the varied response to U.S. foreign policy, particularly the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. By the early 1950s, in the shadow of Cold War red-baiting and rising McCarthyism, two prominent camps emerged in U.S. black scholar activists and political circles. On the one side were the intellectuals who professed a radical anti-racism by continuing the broad critique of colonialism and imperialism, and by insisting that diaspora blacks, Africans, and all colonized people share a common history of oppression and resistance. On the other side were those who, both purposely and unwittingly, embraced the language and framing of Cold War liberalism, what Vignettes calls an anti-communist anti-colonialism. And this included U.S. nationalist and imperialist imaginings in a seeming effort to improve the specific domestic condition of U.S. blacks. These shifts in U.S. black political rhetoric and strategy were very much aided by the long and powerful reach of the state. In the atmosphere of the Cold War, international political maneuvers among U.S. blacks still oppressed by Jim Crow were a liability, especially previous and potential alliances with African liberation groups and other anti-imperialist movements. This was especially clear in the ways that the U.S. government persecuted and ultimately forced the disbanding of groups such as the Council on African Affairs. The CAA, Council on African Affairs, was an organization that was known for its militant diaspora consciousness and radical anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism. And you might know some of its leaders included Paul Robeson. Its activist practices and scholarly enterprise linked the fight for African decolonization to the struggle for civil rights in the U.S. And its message was articulated in the words, quote, "Our fight for Negro rights here in the U.S. is inseparably linked with the liberation movements of people of the Caribbean and Africa and the colonial world in general," end quote. The demise of such groups as the Council on African Affairs, as a result of what Horace Campbell calls low-intensity warfare in the study of Africa and Africans, meant the end of the broad influence of the U.S. black radical tradition of the Pan-Africanist approach to the study of Africa and the diaspora. The purging of these more radical elements of Pan-African political cooperation also went hand in hand with the rise of a moderate sector of U.S. black politics and intellectual tradition. The consequences of these events cannot be overstated. The decidedly political transcontinental tradition of black studies was doubly marginalized. By the 1950s, U.S. mainstream black intellectuals adopted, to varying degrees, both Cold War liberalism definitions of race that disaggregated the previous linking of the black experience to global politics and economy, and particularly to global white supremacy. This moved meant a modification in the understanding of racism. Previously, it was seen as constitutive of the shaping of modern society through the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. Now, it was proclaimed as a unique and anomalous feature of the U.S. and South African democracies. With this, of course, came the acceptance that the U.S. nationalist project was, at its core, free and open, that this liberal state was impartial, with fairness and the moral equality of its citizens as its overarching imperatives. In this context, racism and slavery were but unfortunate appendages to an otherwise sound nationalist program. The emerging liberal idea of race effectively removed attention from global white supremacy. In intellectual practices, the focus shifted from concerns about political economy to interest in isolated notions of culture. The example of the study of Africa among U.S. black scholars is instructive. Its approach ultimately converged with that of what became known as the white Africanist study of Africa. Vignettes demonstrates the silences about the more radical aspects of transnational black organizing among the new type of black scholarship framed by the policies of the Cold War. She singles out Sinclair Drake, one of the most powerful influences in shaping African diaspora studies from the 1950s to the 1980s. She singles him out in particular for his general silence on the significant radical politics of black internationalism, and for his primary framework instead being race relations and his focus on cultural expressions of black identity. Similar to his other liberally inclined intellectual and political contemporaries in the U.S. black community, Drake, it seemed to me, accepted the role of the U.S. as the world leader against an encroaching communism. This was exemplified in the activities of the American Society on African Culture, a group that claimed Drake as an early member. It was later revealed that the American Society on African Culture was organized and funded by the CIA to counter the intellectual and political work of the CAA, the Council on African Affairs. Its intellectual output would soon replace the popular scholarship on Africa and the diaspora. In its explicitly anti-communist and pro-democracy stance, the AMSAC, which is the American Society on African Culture, its work demonstrated the shift from concerns of political economy to concerns of culture. The new organization expressed its main goal as to, quote, defend the great cultural contributions of man against the perversions of political, economic, and natural movements, end quote. Significantly, the organization understood these perversions to be the perceived threat of communism in the former colonies rather than, say, ongoing European imperialism. More to the point, however, was the clear split between research on questions of political economy and studies concerning culture. Whereas CAA promoted cultural needs and practices and the political economy as integrated, AMSAC focused primarily on the cultural linkages in the relationship between Africa and the diaspora. With this popular shift in focus to culture came a general silence on the racialized inequalities structurally embedded in the global political economy, and eventually a decidedly non-radical approach to the study of Africa. And as the funding for AMSAC rose with the popularity of the group's activities, so too came the marginalization of the once prominent leaders of the CAA, including Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois. Sinclair Drake was ultimately correct, however, in his assessment of the general change in articulation of Pan-Africanism. But the inward turn of continental and diaspora blacks towards domestic concerns has to be understood within global dynamics of race, politics, and economics. In post-colonial Africa, the turn to nation building was also marked by the liberalization of intellectual thought as well as politics. The prominent Pan-Africanist voice of Nkrumah and a few others aside, the end of formal colonialism allowed the silencing of the critiques of neo-imperialism, neocolonialism, and white supremacy. Although what Ghanaian political scientist Kwame Boafo Arthur refers to as a liberal triumphalism would not be complete until the 1980s, its apparent influence on emerging independent African states would have long-term political and intellectual implications. This signals a major shift. Emergent African nationalism was articulated in ways that did not allow for direct local intellectual analysis of the legacy of white supremacy. In the excitement over independence, the control over what Nkrumah referred to as the political kingdom, and belief that decolonization was an end in itself, there was no longer concern with the relationship of independent African states to global racial politics. I am arguing, in other words, that with the seeming triumph over colonialism, continental African intellectual output left virtually no room for understanding the historical and ongoing imperial control and its interpolative reach of racialization. Thus, while European colonization was clearly a racializing project, a project that structured not only internal dynamics of ethnicity, culture, and religion, but also the African political and social cultural marginalization that continues in the post-colonial era, we are hard-pressed to find direct analysis of the legacies of this project. This was particularly the case for radical continental intellectuals who were influenced by Marxism. Transcontinental research on the politics of white supremacy gave way to a priority on class analysis, with racism understood to be a subset of class relations. Moreover, in this intellectual trend, race is often conceptualized as racial conflict or race relations, and understood to affect primarily multiracial societies in which one dominant racial group exercises power over non-dominant ones. Since colonial domination and attendant racism were assumed to be tied to European white bodies, independence and the Africanization of political powers, even if rudimentary, naturally reflected an end to racial discord and conflict in the post-colonies. In this context, the contemporary racial contours of Africa's social-political relations with its former political rulers were muted. Continental African intellectual focus, therefore, became primarily with the internal impediments to national identity formation, impediments such as ethnic conflict or concerns with modernization and regional and continental integration. This is not to say, of course, that there were not other points of intellectual inquiry. Christopher Fife, the Nigerian historian, for example, admonished his fellow Africanist colonial historians for failing to analyze European colonization of the African continent as a racial project. Indeed, while there were certainly continental scholars who continued to challenge white Africanists' exceptionalizing treatment of African societies, such as Bernard Magubane, Archie Mafeje, and Peter Rigby, discussions of the racial undercurrent and current manifestations of imperialism, particularly outside of South Africa, were not common. Across the Atlantic, the domestic turn for diaspora blacks was to a cultural nationalism. In the U.S., as well as in other places on the West Atlantic basin, these emerged primarily within the context of the civil rights movements, in which the focus was on black identity formation within hostile nation states. From the late 1950s, the social movements and anti-racist efforts led to various measures of domestic redress for racial terror in the United States, such as the end of legal segregation and the institutionalization of black studies in predominantly white colleges and universities. Yet while such domestic racial reforms were real, their incorporation within a liberal paradigm of race and U.S. nation building actually marked the defeat of more radical aspirations. The ironic result was the reinforcement of the underlying system of racialized structural inequality. Significantly, this domestic turn depended on a black cultural nationalism prominently based on notions of African cultural origins, and with it a necessary relegation of Africa to a past history and attendant exclusion, however unwitting, from modern conceptions of race and blackness. The turn to domestic concerns on both sides of the Atlantic therefore meant, first, a conceptualization of understandings of race from its global and interconnected structural dimensions to more local concerns with national integration. Second, it necessitated the end of the recognition of the coevality of Africa and the diaspora. But we could argue that this was already in the making with the crushing of the radical black left, the sedimentation of Cold War politics, and the hegemonic rise of a new liberalism. It should be remembered also that the prominence of the liberal vision of race in the U.S. in particular signaled a shift in engagements with Africa. No longer prominent were critical studies of political economy and social structure. Instead, the black press, for example, presented disembodied and random facts, often removed from their broader context. And whereas U.S. black leaders and intellectuals and journalists focused on earlier bonds connecting diaspora and African blacks, the emphasis at this moment was on differences between the two groups. Moreover, the new exoticization of Africa converged with the politics of the institutional birth of African diaspora studies and ultimate debates over the role of Africa in the cultural practices of African diaspora communities. Nothing encapsulates this more than the manifestation and influence of the Herskovits-Fraser debate that has arguably shaped all future framing of scholarship on black transnational relations. For me, What is most significant about this debate is its epistemological force. The intellectual legacy of the Fraser-Herskovits debate is also responsible for the conceptual split between scholarship on Africa and scholarship on the African diaspora. Tellingly, Melville Herskovits is, for some, often considered the father of both African studies and African diaspora studies in the U.S., which for all intents and purposes signals a number of shifts. First, the institutionalization and attendant white takeover of African studies as well as African diaspora studies. Second, the ironic end of the mutual interrogation of contemporary continental and diasporic phenomena. And three, the epistemic convergence of mainstream black and white scholars on Africa as the cultural ancestor rather than coeval producer of black culture and identity. It was largely the adoption of a liberal sensibility in the institutionalized study of black and other non-white population that opened up the space for the Fraser-Herskovits debate in the first place. And through the debate, the exceptionalist construction of continental Africa and in intellectual and journalistic circles would be solidified with the epistemological merging of the Africanist tradition of African studies and U.S.-led African diaspora studies, with the attendant marginalization of the transcontinental tradition and the more radical elements of black scholarship. I'm almost done. While Martin and West are correct in their conclusion that the Africanist enterprise, particularly the intellectual histories of such enterprise, has mostly silenced this transcontinental tradition, we also have to take into account the internal politics of the black diaspora population, particularly regarding the U.S. black political and intellectual traditions, as members engage in the ongoing negotiations of identity in the context of global structures that were and are inherently anti-black. Indeed, as Malini Shula reminds us, academic practices within the U.S. university, particularly those of the humanities and social sciences, cannot be understood without their relationship to imperialism, which has structured the production of knowledge through different apparatuses. The Africanist tradition of African studies emerged directly as a result of the interweaving factors of U.S. imperial ascendancy, lasting colonialist structures in a post-colonial world, and the rise of the social sciences with the increasing importance of narrower, scientifically verifiable objects of inquiry. This tradition was also, I argue, a beneficiary of the shift in black radical and diaspora internal politics. Though broad and definitely not exhaustive, this historical background allows us the space to map out and contextualize the rise of certain popular trends in African studies and African diaspora studies. The contemporary study of Africa and black internationalism is steeped in what many would call nationalist paradigms, still subsumed within a liberal framework about race and Africa. That is not to say, of course, that the radical transcontinental tradition no longer exists. It certainly does. Yet it remains on the margins of mainly, that is, institutionalized, black studies, overshadowed by debates about whether it is important to first link the experiences of Africa, of race and blackness, and of diaspora, and second, link them to global processes of racialization and white supremacy. To reiterate, some key theoretical and epistemological consequences of this history, as I've traced, are as follows. First, there's a shift in the treatment of race, in which the analytical lens narrows and moves away from the focus on the interconnected realities of global white supremacy. Second, there's a shift in the treatment of Africa, in which culture against structure becomes the primary lens through which the continent is apprehended. And third, there's a clear bifurcation between the scholarship and research of continental Africa and on the African diaspora. And an important related consequence of these shifts is, importantly, the isolated treatment of the transatlantic slave trade and hemispheric colonialism and slavery on the one hand, and European colonialism of the African continent on the other. This is a move that not only links issues of race primarily to the enslavement of the New World, but also gives the New World ownership of that history, while it simultaneously excludes it from colonial and post-colonial Africa. These consequences continue to play out in prominent trends in contemporary African studies and African diaspora studies or Black studies. In particular, there is what I'm calling a problematic of race in African studies and Black studies, where differing notions and deployments have worked to delimit the ways that Africa and Blackness are conceptualized in the respective fields. Prominent trends in African studies have either taken race for granted or reinforced racializing tropes of Africa, and at the same time have not acknowledged the continued significance of Africa's racialization to the articulation of modern processes, including the articulation of Blackness. At the same time, prominent sections of African diaspora studies have either taken Africa for granted, or reinforced Africa's marginalization while unable to acknowledge Africa's contemporary racialized existence. The fact that there hardly seems to be a theoretical dynamic that affords a conceptual entree for issues of race in post-colonial Africa, and that Africa continues to be a mere baseline consideration when it comes to discussions of diasporic identity formation, is testament to both a particular historical amnesia and a certain poverty of theory. It is also, I believe, evidence of the ongoing inability to fully and concretely come to terms with the mutuality of African and diasporic social historical experiences, an analogous set of experiences structured through empire, racial capitalism, and racial terror. So I began this presentation by highlighting the bifurcation in the study of global Black populations that occurs when the historically structured mutuality of Black experience is not often considered crucial to analysis either in African studies or diaspora studies. This split, I have argued, is a direct result of a confluence of historical events that not only shaped the professional trajectories of the two fields, but also fundamentally impacted theoretical and epistemological developments in each. Key to these events and consequent developments is the trope of Africa and the idea of race, as well as their relationship to structures of power, the structure of racialization and the power of knowledge production. In thinking through this legacy and reviewing the intellectual history of Black internationalism, I am moved by certain questions. What are the ideological and conceptual precepts guiding contemporary research on Black identity formations? In what ways did the various and contentious meanings of Africa remain central to cultural and political debates about community and identity? I am in no way attempting to answer these questions today, but my broader argument is that neither diaspora theorization nor studies concerned with continental Africa have provided the necessary tools for addressing the interconnected particularities of continental and African diasporic experience. So we need to develop new research agendas in African studies and in African diaspora studies on both sides of the Atlantic. Thank you.
If we could take a moment again to thank Dr. Pierre for her wonderful keynote address.
Thank you.
Dr. Pierre just told me she's willing to take some questions, so please feel free.
So thank you so much. That was so great. I work on France and Francophone Africa, so I am framed this talk very much in the context of U.S. national projects and the development of U.S. African studies. So does post-war racial liberalism provide the same kind of framework for Europe-Africa relations? Since, in the trajectory that you're tracing is one sort of question, and whether or not you see Black Francophone intellectuals sort of challenging or upsetting the narrative that you have constructed, or whether or not they sort of fit into it just in a different way. And then just out of curiosity, I was wondering what you think of decolonial theory and that literature that is, trying to construct a really different narrative of some kind of anti-colonial thought in this moment that is doing something different, that is Pan-African, diasporic, and beyond even the Black intellectual community, sort of thinking more broadly. That's a lot of questions, but I'd also love to hear what you think about Black European studies. Pick what of those you want to do.
Right. I mean, is Professor Young? because I feel like she would be perfect for the question about Black European studies and the Black Francophone response. I think, yeah, so I was talking directly to U.S. African studies, the development of area studies in the U.S., but that actually doesn't take France in particular, of all places, outside of the thinking about racial liberalism. France, in fact, the problem with the French national discourse on race is that one is not allowed, right? I mean, and so the relationship to Africa could be a racialized one. You just can't articulate it in that way. And I think part of the work in Africa among French scholars continues in similar ways to the British that were very much linked to the imperialism and colonialism, and then the Americans were who's the new empire in place. And so I think there someone would have to trace that specific history of like France, national politics around race, and then its relationship to scholarship on Africa. But the racializing of scholarship on Africa, or the inability to deal with white supremacy in terms of the post-colonial moment, is a problem that I think Black scholars in Europe would tell you remains, right, for France. Now the decolonial theory work, I think